What are your feelings about, what do you see going on in your classroom or in terms of bullying in this fourth grade level that concerns you, and what can be done to address it?
Well, I think I'd like to start to say I'm a second year teacher, so I haven't had as long as some teachers to really work out strategies and techniques for dealing with bullying. This is my second year, and but that being said, I feel like, well, brain research shows that if you feel like you're being threatened, if you feel like you're nervous or anxious, your brain doesn't work as well. You can't process things because obviously you're not focusing on those things, you're focusing on a perceived threat. Like brain research shows that you're most receptive to learning when you're being praised, when you feel comfortable, when you are getting a lot of positive feedback. And it is just absolutely intuitive that if you're being bullied, those are not the conditions that you're feeling. So bullying is primarily a concern, if you want to break it down to the academic side, bullying inhibits learning to an incredible degree. That aside from the whole social aspect of it, but it's definitely shutting down learning. So bullying needs to be seen, it needs to be spotted, it needs to be addressed. Now that being said, bullying, in my opinion, is like low-level guerrilla warfare. Okay? There are sneak attacks going on all over the place, and if you're going to deal with it, you have to deal with it like an insurgency. And how we deal with insurgencies, particularly in the battlefield in the Middle East, in places like Afghanistan, in places like Iraq, is you can't go and you can't impose your strict structure. Yes, if I wanted to, I could bully any bully in my classroom into submission, but that's not how it should be done. What you need to do is you need to create a culture in your classroom where kids are buying into the idea that bullying is wrong. You need to work with them so that kids, even at the fourth grade level, are incredibly bright. Okay. That being said, they're not as emotionally mature. They haven't reached that level of development and self-awareness that comes later. So, that being said, there are definitely limits to this, but you can reason with them. You can explain things like, bullying is not just bad for, you in terms of how you feel. It's also bad for how you, how you learn. You can talk about the repercussions of that. You can also talk about how bullying is bad for the bully. When you bully someone, on some level, it makes you feel bad because almost every child I've ever met knows intrinsically the difference between right and wrong. Kids at this age are beginning to learn how to empathize with other kids through their reading, through talking, and that's one of the big goals as a teacher, is to get them thinking about other people's feelings. A lot of what we do in class is analyze what's going on with stories, which allows them to project themselves into the characters in the story. And in that way, we also want to have them project themselves into the other kids in the class. Think about it from their perspective. See it from their perspective. Bullying takes a lot of different forms. It can be physical bullying, it can be verbal bullying, it can be emotional bullying, it can be social bullying. And what I mean by social bullying, and it's incredibly fluid, right? So I have to rely not on what I see, I have to rely on what the other kids are seeing and what they're telling me. So the first thing that has to happen is I need to build a rapport of trust with my kids, and if I say something, if I tell them I will protect them from something, I need to protect them. I need to follow through, and they need to know they can trust me. They also need to know that they can trust me to tell me things that I'm not going to then turn around and use against them, like, or embarrass them, or call them out, or put them in a position that they can't handle. So, like I said, it's an insurgency, all right? There's always going to be this low-level guerrilla warfare because that's the nature of the beast. You have kids, their little personalities conflicting, their emerging personalities. There's this desire to be dominant, to be seen as cool, and beside that, there's an incredible fear of being alone, being left out of the group, being seen strange, you know. And those are really big fears. So I try and address those fears as well. When bullying is going on, usually I'll hear about it from the child who's being bullied, or almost equally as often from people around them who care about that kid, who aren't afraid to come up and advocate for it. So that's something that I definitely talk about in class, or I try to.
Now, have you been able to actually reach out to the bully themselves and have them turn around their perspective on what they're doing and you know, make a complete turnaround and stop that behavior?
Nothing's ever black and white, and you're not gonna have some. I mean, at least I've never experienced some child suddenly going, "Oh my God, you're right, I am all months." Not so much. But have I seen a diminishing of the bullying? Absolutely. Number one, you make it very uncool to be a bully. Like, you point out, if someone's bullying someone, you point out why that's wrong, and you let kids know that if they see that behavior, and you talk about why it's uncool, you know. We talked a lot about President Obama's speech, where he said, you were judged not by what you destroy, but what you build. And when you're being a bully, and this isn't something that I've, this is just a tie-in that we talked about one day. This is the whole theme of my year, but I took advantage of that. You look for teachable moments. You know, when you're bullying someone, you're destroying how they feel about themselves. You're not building them up, you know? And this is kind of like, and as much as I would love to say that all of this comes across in my class and all these are things that I've said explicitly to my kids, it's much more shady than that. Like, I try and sneak these messages in, I try and deal with this whenever I can, but there are probably much better ways I can more systematically handle it. But that being said, let me talk about one example of bullying that I had in my classroom.
Okay, that was my next question, actually.
And this is very interesting because it illustrates the fluid nature of bullying. So I have two girls, and if you want to talk about two more physically dimorphic children, like one is this tall, one is enormous, you know, or not enormous, but much larger. So one is physically more intimidating. And what happened is it began as a situation where the larger child literally was bullying the smaller child physically, and they ended up getting in a fight. Surprisingly, the smaller child fought back like a wild animal, and during the fight actually was perceived as the winner by their classmates, which had an interesting effect. On one hand, I personally admire the fact that she stood herself and defended herself against the physical attack and the physical bullying that was going on. What then happened was a subtle shift in her behavior, where she received, and I heard about this from other children, more from talking. You have to talk to the kids all the time, many times. And you were observing my class, you saw how many short period I had to talk to like one kid like totally alone, or two kids, or you know, because what I think that boy was doing at the table was a form of bullying. I mean, he was very much
like you mentioned verbal. That's a form of just written bullying.
Exactly, and like, but anyway, so this girl then, I don't know if she liked the idea that she'd become a quote unquote bad girl, like that now that she had defeated this other girl in a physical battle. Like, she now took on this role as, well, now I'm not afraid of anything. And she began verbally bullying the girl who had previously bullied her physically.
So she in turn became aggressive as a result of that.
Absolutely. I won't go into my personal politics, but it's the Israel syndrome. You know, like following the Holocaust, who becomes the most aggressive nation, you know, like.
But you're right, you learn, you repeat and you learn from the actions of bullies unless the cycle is stopped. And so she learned to bully, although she realized that the physicality of bullying wasn't her cup of tea, but she was very popular. And so what she did was then she began verbally taunting the child who physically bullied her. She began verbally bullying her. And she began socially bullying her, creating a coalition of her peers turning against this other child, until the child who originally had begun the physical bullying was completely ostracized, to the point where this child every day would spend half the day in tears.
Amazing.
And so then immediately I had to go in and I had to find ways to stop that. And, you know, in every situation.
Spiraling down.
From spiraling down, because, okay, well, yes, I'm glad that she's no longer beating you up, but I'm not happy that you've become, you know, her tormentor either. And that now she is crippled emotionally. And I see huge, and as soon as the verbal and social bullying began on the first child who was physically abusive in the beginning, her grades went from borderline B's, C's, 4 D's. 4 D's. I mean, it was incredible. I've never seen her drop like that. She literally couldn't. And what was happening was she was becoming, because she was big and she was physical, she was becoming, and she also has issues with impulsivity. She would scream at the other child who was her tormentors, her perceived tormentors. She would lash out. She would hit. She would, you know, we were getting all this violent blowback. So, first thing I had to do was separate them physically with as much room as possible. Like they're literally at diametric ends of the classroom. But then I had to give the child who was focusing on her tormentors a means to, I had to give her some agency to express herself without feeling like she had to scream or act out. So what I did is every morning I was giving her a piece of paper, a yellow slip, where she wrote down everything her perceived, well, they weren't perceived, they actually were tormenting her, what these kids were doing, right? And then that became a dialogue between me and her. But then that also, those letters became a springboard for me to then deal with the people who were verbally and also socially bullying.
Just a quick question. I'm just curious. Have you, going back to your own, you know, experiences in school as a fourth grader, you know, have you seen an increase in bullying in comparison to when you were a child, or did you also experience bullying? Is it just a part of life, or is it just a?
It is a part of human nature at the most visceral level. No, I think that bullying now, if anything, there's so much more of an emphasis on preventing it, you know. Like, I think that people are much more cognizant of it now than they were when I was young. I mean, my dad's advice, I grew up in a very small rural farming community in Vermont. My dad's advice is if someone hits you, hit them again, and knock them down, and keep hitting them until they stop moving. Like, that was the advice I was sent to school with. And I remember being dumped from 4th grade, where my fourth grade had like 14 kids, to then going to the big middle school, which was a regional middle school, where my class suddenly had 25, and there were 3 other classes that big. And I got punched in the face, like I think my second day on the playground, and it shook me. It shook me bad, and like I was really I was a very sweet and sensitive kid, and from the minute I got hit, it changed me, and slowly I learned to fight back, and I learned to become much more aggressive, and for better or worse, there are still echoes of that in my behavior today. You know, hitting someone and thinking, oh my gosh, I hope I don't kill him. Because I really didn't want to hurt the kid. But I knew that if I didn't hit him back, I was going to keep getting hit. You know? And that's something that, and to this day, I am a loud, occasionally abrasive, aggressive person. And a lot of that was shaped by what happened in middle school. And I think if that hadn't happened, I'd be a very different person. I don't know if I'd be better. I don't know if I'd be worse, but I'd be different.
Well, I think that concludes my questioning.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for sharing so much. You know, something came to mind. I remember seeing a video in one of my classes about this experiment that was done in, I forgot what grade level, it was the second grade, but it was, you know, all the blue-eyed kids in this classroom are inferior to all the brown-eyed kids. Are you familiar with that?
I've heard of similar things. They do something in the 7th grade upstairs when they're studying the Holocaust, where every kid is randomly assigned a color, yellow or blue, and they don't say anything about it. And then like halfway through the year, this line of tape comes, and everyone who has blue has to be on one side of the tape, and they cannot go across. The ones who have yellow, they can go on either side, but the ones who have blue have to go on that side. And then walkways start to appear. And then they can't just walk anywhere they want on the blue side, they have to start, and it creates a bluish ghetto. And so they literally slowly start building in these but it's very much like that.
It's segregation.
And then, but soon, like the blue-eyed kids, if I remember what I've heard right, start scoring worse because they're told that they're inferior, right?
Right. Yes, they do.
And it starts actually showing up in their scores, and they're like, well, it's amazing how you. Yeah, totally. I've totally heard of that.
I mean, that it's very similar to. I mean, it's right there. That's the cousin of bullying because you're being told that you have no worth, really.
That's what bullying is.
Yeah.
It's domination, like in some way or another, instead of like celebration. It's like I'm gonna beat you down instead of saying, like, oh wow, I learned something from you.
Right, and the sad thing is that again, you're right. It is part of human nature, and it continues to adulthood. I mean, adults bully each other, but it's on a totally different level.
Absolutely. And you talk about like what's going on with the environment right now, and our environment, our economy. We've passed the paradigm. We've passed the point where this paradigm works. We've passed the point where going by instinct and human nature and allowing dumb structures, like capitalism, like conscious-less structures, run our societies is going to work. And we are now being forced to overcome this. We're not. So we'll see how it goes.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Eastman.